Today we have the second last talk of Chobi Mela and the most awaited talk of Chobi Mela by Arundhati, the utmost everything with the festival director Dr. Shahidul Alam. Can we give another round of applause? As I mentioned just a few minutes back, before we start to go ahead, another reminder, please do not take photographs and video and stop live streaming. Thank you very much. I'm handing over to Shahidul Alam.
Okay, wow, look at this. And we have you with us, finally. Well, thank you for being so patient. It's been an interesting day with a few variations. We thought we'd put it to the theatre just to make it interesting for you. I think we should begin. We've been waiting a long time. Arundhati, well, firstly, welcome to Dhaka, welcome to Bangladesh, welcome to Chobi Mela. It's fantastic to have you with us. We've been trying to do it for a long time. And in typical Bangladeshi fashion, of course, we claim you because if you're parented, things like that. Whatever we can find, you know, a father who had Bangladeshi roots and all that sort of thing, we try and get through to us. But you're here for Chobi Mela 10, and one of the things I'd like to bring up is that when we started talking about it, we did try it before, but this time when we talked about it, one of the first things you were concerned about was who our sponsors would be. I mean, it didn't matter in the end, because you know, we seem to have lost most of our sponsors, and except for one, we're so toxic no one wants to come near us. But Nan Golding in the United States and so many artists in India have now been making a statement about sponsorship, about whether they would participate in things where certain types of money was coming in. So I think that's interesting. But leaving that aside, what is it that brings you to Chobi Mela? Why are you here?
Because of you and because of all of you. But honestly, Shahidul, I want to say that
this one here, no? Put it out.
It's power unity कैसे का? ऐसा ये कोड है. ये देखो, इधर तो चलेगा. इधर चलेगा सर.
Right. So now please, like the major thing. What's the major thing?
Series of.
भाई वो ही कौन एक पॉइंट है हाँ दिखला
इटा कैसे का ये तो लॉक है
you plug in my
You get your phone? Your phone.
Yeah, so one of the things that I mean, the reputation of Chobi Mela, of course, precedes my life. One of the things I really admire about what you managed to do is that I see a whole generation of young people who have been raised in this institution of yours, you know, and that is so rare, that act of generosity of creating a space where I see the photographers and their work as being a cut above what's going on in other places, and I really admire that ability to create an institution. About the sponsorship, see the reason that I don't go to corporate sponsored events, no one can be that pure. I mean, even I can sort of make mistakes and not know where the money for something comes from. But the reason that I don't go is because I've seen how insidious it is, the atmosphere that these foundations and corporations create, you know. And let's say in India, the biggest literary festival, the Jaipur Literary Festival, is at the moment the main sponsor is a completely fascist television channel who creates a platform in a small place where big writers come and they speak about big ideas. But in fact, you know, you're talking about a TV channel that's just spewing venom all the time. Before that, it was mining companies, you know. So I would go into the forest and watch what the destruction that was happening there, the death, the killing, the displacement, the robbing of livelihoods, and then these same people are funding culture and literature, and you know, it's not something that one can. You know, I'm not saying everybody should boycott it, and you know, people have to do what they have to do, but I just think it was important to make that statement.
Well, it was very important for us to see that, particularly because when we compared it with what happened here, I mean, in Bangladesh, writers, artists in general have had this long tradition of resistance, you know, from the language movement, 71, even post-71 for a while, but today we're in a situation where so many prominent artists are silent. Some are getting killed, some are getting disappeared, but the ones who should be speaking are not speaking. In your end, I mean, I remember you talking about returning your national awards. I don't see that happening here, but it is good to see that that is a trend that's still going strong.
Yeah, it is. At the same time, you have, I mean, Shahidul is talking about, I think it was 2015 or 2016 when, you know, there was a whole spate of assassinations of writers, and then there was, I don't know, this is kind of speaking back to me. Yeah, so, so there was lynching of people being accused of eating beef and so on, and so a whole lot of writers in protest returned their national awards. But subsequently there has been, and generally I'm saying not just for now, but there has been a sense in which artists, writers, actors, all of them have been somehow made to believe that their place is in the marketplace, you know, somewhere between bestseller lists and literature festivals and film festivals and so on, and to create art that is cognizant. I'm not saying I'm not a great votary of art which is just called propaganda of any kind, but at the same time, art which is just not cognizant of what is going on around you means nothing to me either, you know. So often I think of the fact that artists have been made less dangerous, not by benign regimes, but by placing them in the marketplace and making them commercially viable products. And that has been more seductive than any kind of ruthlessness or censorship. You know?
Well, on that note, I mean, it is important that you're here, the fact that we are able to work across borders at a time when there's a virtual war, or people are gearing up for war, the fact that artists, and certainly in recent times we've worked together, but maybe on that note we could go to that little video that you were referring to, which was quite nice. Could we see a video, please, the first video?
I'll just explain what it was, this little video. It was just made like a couple of weeks ago, because just 2 days ago, on Saturday and Sunday in fact, a whole lot of artists, filmmakers, musicians, rap singers, classical musicians, qawwals, painters came together in Delhi, just outside the Red Fort, you know, where the Prime Minister usually gives his Republic Day speech. They came together to protest against the, it was called Nafrat ke Khilaf, you know, against the politics of hate, basically, which is the policy of this current government in India. And quite amusingly, during the protest, the local BJP former MLA came and he said, I hear that you're doing an anti-government protest. So they said, no, we are just doing a protest which is called Nafrat ke Khilaf, against hate, you know. And he said, yeah, that comes to the same thing.
Can we have the video, please? Perhaps we could have some lights there. Or is that okay?
Artists unite? Why? Aren't we the ones who are meant to argue, disagree, push the limits, ask the big questions? To unite is really part of our mandate. If we do indeed have a mandate, I don't think we're meant to. On second thought, if we don't unite, perhaps we will no longer be able to argue, disagree, push the limits, ask the big questions. We just all have to agree with your opinion, and you know what? Or get jailed, or shot, or banned, or beaten. So yeah, okay, for now at least, artists unite. And if you can't, not living life, then please at least stand up straight, get off your knees and spare us the selfies of yourself kissing ass.
The last part where it says spare us the selfies of yourselves kissing ass refers to this whole lot of Bollywood actors who got on a plane and came to Delhi and got selfies taken with Modi right before the election. And that's the interesting thing, that the bigger you are, filmmakers, for example, who are having to put lakhs and lakhs of crores, millions into their films, and then any moment the mob can just stop it. So these people who are so huge and so powerful in some ways are completely powerless, in front of the politicians.
So what I'd like to do is just map out perhaps how we'll go, but that does remind me about celebrities here queuing up to become MPs, but we won't go into that one. In terms of how we pan out the day today, we'll start with the God of Small Things, and through 20 years of political essays, and Arundhati will be reading a few of the passages. We'll move on to the Ministry of Utmost Happiness, which have this long gap in between, and we'll show a 6-minute film which talks about the landscape of the film, really, how that film pans out. But I'd like to come back to how you got into this. I mean, you studied architecture, worked in cinema, writer, actor, production designer. I remember the last time we met, there was the yoga mat that you were just unfurling, and I realized that you were also an aerobic instructor or something like that. But for me, what struck me really was what you said was your first coherent statement, and I'm rather drawn to it. I'll read out that statement. I hate Miss Mitten, and I think her knickers are torn.
Well, that was, when I was very young, I must have been 4 or 5 years old, and my mother and my father were divorced, and she had left Shillong and come down to the south, and we were in this little town called Ooty, which was full of white missionaries at the time, and there was this Australian missionary called Miss Mitten, and she was my teacher, and she was teaching us maths, and I used to count on my fingers, and then she very cleverly did a sum which was beyond 10, like whatever, 8 plus 5 or something. And so I took off my shoes and counted on my toes, and then I put my shoes back on, and she said, how did you do this? And I somehow got into my head that it was quite sinful to take off your shoes and count on your toes, so I wasn't going to admit that. So I said, I did it in my head. And from that day onwards, she used to tell me every day, I can see Satan in your eyes. So when I went home, the first sentence I ever wrote in my life was, I hate Miss Mitten and I think her knickers are torn. I mean, I know what the connection was, but, whatever. So,
well, after that initial literature, you went on to say, fiction is the closest form to prayer that what you can get. And that particular form of prayer led to The God of Small Things, which went on to win the Man Booker Prize for fiction in '97, sell 6 million copies. The languages, that was, I think, translated into 42, and the Ministry of Utmost Happiness into 47. Now that, well, maybe before I go on to the next bit, perhaps you could do a little reading from there. Yeah?
Yeah, I will. I mean, a lot of people asked me, how is it possible that your first book was this one, because it's a very ambitious book. And I said, no, actually, it's the opposite. I'm a deeply unambitious person, and I was sure that only 17 people would read it, so I was prepared to take big risks. And I had no idea. Obviously, I worked on it for many years, and I had no idea what would become of it. So whether it was, 6 or 8 or whatever million people, or whether it was 20 people, it would have been the same book.
I can hold the mic if that makes it
easy.
easy.
No, it's fine. So I'm just going to read you a small passage from The God of Small Things. In a purely practical sense, it would probably be correct to say that it all began when Sophie Mole came to Imanum. Perhaps it's true that things can change in a day, that a few dozen hours can affect the outcome of whole lifetimes, and that when they do, those few dozen hours, like the salvaged remains of a burned house, the charred clock, the singed photograph, the scorched furniture, must be resurrected from the ruins and examined, preserved, accounted for. Little events, ordinary things, smashed and reconstituted, imbued with new meaning, suddenly they become the bleached bones of a story. Still, to say that it all began when Sophie Mole came to Imanum is only one way of looking at it. Equally, it could be argued that it actually began thousands of years ago, long before the Marxists came, before the British took Malabar, before the Dutch ascendancy, before Vasco da Gama arrived, before the Zamorin's conquest of Calicut, before 3 purple-robed Sicilian bishops murdered by the Portuguese were found floating in the sea with coiled sea serpents riding on their chests and oysters knotted in their tangled beards. It could be argued that it began long before Christianity arrived in a boat and seeped into Kerala like tea from a tea bag. That it really began in the days when the love laws were made, the laws that lay down who should be loved and how much.
You have famously said, it's our job to be unpopular. It's our job to stand alone and say what we really think. Not as activists, but as writers. Now as I look around here in this room and I see the queue that's outside, I think you've not done a particularly good job of being unpopular. And of course the God of Small Things came, you became an instant celebrity, you were feted at all levels everywhere. But you turned your back to fame, and particularly when we think of the fact that political writing doesn't really do much for careers. That's what you took on, and for a very, very long time, that's what you did. So what made you turn your back on stardom and take on political writing?
I'll tell you in a minute, but it reminds me of when you said that I was a failure at not being famous or successful. When I was very young, when I was about 2 or 3 years old, my mother's older brother, who's a completely fascinating character, it was my birthday, and everyone was giving me this advice about doing well and coming first and all that. And he showed me a bauble, and he said, "I'll give you this if you fail." And I have such a clear memory of being so interested in the idea of failure then, that it seemed a more interesting thing to me than success in some ways. And it is something that's always complicated my view of success or achievement or anything. But yeah, to come back to your question, soon after The God of Small Things was published, and obviously I won the Booker Prize, and I was, on the cover of every magazine in India. Very soon after that, the current, right-wing Hindutva brigade came to power, and within weeks of coming to power, they did a series of nuclear tests. And I I was so taken aback at the fact that those tests to me introduced a new public language into India, you know. Things that you couldn't really say openly and officially, suddenly you could say. There was so much triumphalism, so much nationalism, so much hatred in the air. And I was at that time being, you know, I was part of that national pride parade, you know, the girl that had sort of conquered the world in some ways in this field, you know. So I didn't have a choice. I mean, to stay quiet would have been as political as to speak out at that time. And so I wrote the first political essay called The End of Imagination, in which which just it created a kind of rage against me, which was equal to the earlier embrace in certain quarters, and of course it was reversed in other quarters. But I said in that essay that I wasn't talking just about nuclear war. I was talking about that too, but I was talking about what the idea of having these nuclear weapons does to your imagination and how it colonizes your imagination. And I said, you know, if it's anti-Indian and anti-Hindu to have a nuclear bomb implanted in my brain, then I secede. I hereby declare myself a mobile republic. I have no passport, I have no flag, and so on. And of course, that was just like incendiary for them at the time. And I was, that was a complete sort of, let's say, I just stepped into another world from there. You know, another world in which I traveled for 20 years. But I'd like to read a small passage from that essay, The End of Imagination. So this passage is it's from a section of The End of Imagination where I'm actually speaking to a college friend of mine who lives in New York, and who was telling me that, you know, she was telling me that now she's a very cruel person, actually. That's why I liked her. And she's telling me that the only thing that can match the excitement of what has happened to you with this incredibly successful book and this incredible prize and all that is going to be your death, my death. So I'll just read this part. I said, "You've lived too long in New York," I told her. "There are other worlds, other kinds of dreams, dreams in which failure is feasible, honorable, sometimes even worth striving for. Worlds in which recognition is not the only barometer of brilliance or human worth. There are plenty of warriors that I know and love, people far more valuable than myself, who go to war each day, knowing in advance that they will fail. True, they are less successful in the most vulgar sense of the word, but by no means less fulfilled. The only dream worth having," I told her, "is to dream that you will live while you're alive and die only when you're dead." Which means exactly what? She asked, arched eyebrows, a little annoyed. I tried to explain, but didn't do a very good job of it, because sometimes I need to write to think. So I wrote it down for her on a paper napkin, and this is what I wrote. To love, to be loved, to never forget your own insignificance, to never get used to the unspeakable violence and the vulgar disparity of life around you, to seek joy in the saddest places, to pursue beauty to its lair, to never simplify what is complicated or complicate what is simple, to respect strength, never power, above all to watch, to try and understand, to never look away, and never, never to forget.
Your next big essay was about big dams, and there I want to come to Bangladesh as well, because one of the things that's surprised me is when I've met Indian friends who are otherwise very open, well-educated, progressive, I've found that they seem to be unaware of the fact that the link between India and Bangladesh is much more tenuous than it perhaps was, considering the role that India has played in the liberation of Bangladesh. I don't know, today if there's a cricket match between India and Pakistan, the audience here will be divided, which surprises me. And it does surprise me that people in India, even journalists in India, aren't really aware of what water means to an agrarian nation, what water means to a farmer. And the water sharing treatment that was never a water sharing treatment because there was no sharing, has lingered for this long. Farakka Dam, Sundarbans, what's happening with the energy projects here, it's hugely problematic, but I see how those links are. Perhaps you could read us something from the Narmada essay, or it would be good for the audience to see where the linkages are.
I think one of the, I was talking to some activists this morning, and I was saying that, like when you see it from the point of view and with the language of India and Bangladesh, sometimes what happens, I've stopped using these words like India, Pakistan, Bangladesh. Why? Because actually it's the elites in these countries who are one country. One of the things I keep saying is it's the elites who've seceded into outer space, and from there they look down and say, what is their water doing in, what is our water doing in their rivers, and what is our wood doing in their forests, and what is our coal doing in their villages, So even within India, the battles that are fought over dams and the sharing of water, to me, in so many ways, the seeds of fascism lie in the foundations of big dams. So do the seeds of nationalism, and this is why the arrogance of people who do not see that resources need to be equitably shared, and they don't understand even doing what they are doing is eventually going to destroy them. It's not going to help them, So for so many years, the Narmada movement fought the most brilliant, beautiful battle. To me, I learned so much from being associated with that movement, and today, after all those years that dam has been built, every single thing that they said has come true. The first village, indigenous people's village that was displaced in order to build the dam engineer's house, where those indigenous people then worked as servants in those houses. Today that, statue of Sardar Patel, which is, 3 times the height of the Statue of Liberty, where the villagers are not even the equivalent of dirt in its toenails, stands. And those are monuments to human failure and disaster. But the essay that I wrote about Narmada, which is called The Greater Common Good, to me it was, something which taught me so deeply that my politics is not just about human beings. It's about rivers, it's about earth, it's about the fish, it's about how these things are all connected. It was easier for me. I grew up in a village on the banks of a river, and so my world was never human-centric, But again, much of what I write is a meditation about the nature of power. So I'm just talking about, after I was traveling in the valley, and one of the games that they play is that who counts as project affected. So the people who are displaced by the reservoir of the dam count as project affected. The people who are displaced by the canals are as many
but they are not counted as project affected. So I arrived, as the light was failing, in the house of this farmer called Bhaiji Bhai, who's an Adivasi farmer. And I was sort of wondering, I've never been to this village, I've never met this man, but how come I know him? Like I know him. Somehow, there was this constant sense of I know this person. And then I realized that he was the man who every film crew, every journalist had gone and met. And he had spoken for years and years and years about how he lost everything to this dam, So that's why I thought I knew him, but I didn't. The last person I met in the valley was Bhaiji Bhai. He's a Tadwi Adivasi from Undawa, one of the first villages where the government began to acquire land for the canal and his 75,000 kilometer network. Bhaiji Bhai lost 17 of his 19 acres to the Wonder Canal. It crashes through his land 700 feet wide, including its walkways and steep sloping embankments, like a velodrome for giant bicyclists. Like his neighbors in Kevadia colony, Bhaiji Bhai became a pauper overnight. Bhaiji Bhai and his people forced to smile for photographs on government calendars. Bhaiji Bhai and his people denied the grace of rage. Bhaiji Bhai and his people squashed like bugs by this country they are supposed to call their own. It was late evening when I arrived at his house. We sat down on the floor and drank oversweet tea in the dying light. As he spoke, a memory stirred in me, a sense of déjà vu. I couldn't imagine why. I knew I hadn't met him before, and then I realized what it was. I hadn't recognized him, but I remembered his story. I'd seen him in old films shot more than 10 years ago in the valley. He was frailer now, his beard softened with age. But his story hadn't aged. It was still young and full of passion. It broke my heart, the patience with which he told it. I could tell he had told it over and over and over again, hoping, praying that one day one of the strangers passing through Undawa would turn out to be good luck or God. Bhaiji Bhai, when will you get angry? When will you stop waiting? When will you say, that's enough, and reach for your weapons, whatever they may be? When will you show us the whole of your resonant, terrifying, invincible strength? When will you break the faith? Will you break the faith? Or will you let it break you? To slow a beast, you break its limbs. To slow a nation, you break its people. You rob them of volition. You demonstrate your absolute command over their destiny. You make it clear that ultimately it falls to you to decide who lives, who dies, who prospers, who doesn't. To exhibit your capability, you show off all that you can do and how easily you can do it. How easily you could press a button and annihilate the earth. How you can start a war or sue for peace. How you can snatch a river away from one and gift it to another. How you can green a desert or fell a forest and plant one somewhere else. You use caprice to fracture a people's faith in ancient things. Earth, forest, water, air. Once that's done, what do they have left? Only you. They turn to you because you're all they have. They will love you even while they despise you. They will trust you even though they know you well. They will vote for you even as you squeeze the very breath from their bodies. They will drink what you give them to drink. They will breathe what you give them to breathe. They will live where you dump their belongings. They have to. What else can they do? There's no higher court of redress. You're their mother and their father. You're the judge and the jury. You are the world, you're God. Power is fortified not just by what it destroys, but also by what it creates. Not just by what it takes, but also by what it gives. And powerlessness is reaffirmed not just by the helplessness of those who have lost, but also by the gratitude of those who have or think they have gained. This cold, contemporary cast of power is couched between the lines of noble-sounding clauses in democratic-sounding constitutions. It's wielded by the elected representatives of an ostensibly free people. Yet, no monarch, no despot, no dictator in any other century in the history of human civilization has had access to weapons like these. Day by day, river by river, forest by forest, mountain by mountain, missile by missile, bomb by bomb, almost without our knowing it, we are being broken. Big dams are to a nation what nuclear bombs are to its military arsenal. They are both weapons of mass destruction. They are both weapons governments use to control their own people, both 20th century emblems that mark a point in time when human intelligence has outstripped its own instinct for survival. They are both malignant indications of a civilization turning upon itself. They represent the severing of the link, not just the link, the understanding between human beings and the planet they live on. They scramble the intelligence that connects eggs to hens, milk to cows, food to forests, water to rivers, air to life, and the earth to human existence.
Well, that essay did get you into trouble. And that perhaps is one of the areas where we connect. We both ended up in jail for various reasons. You with contempt of court and other things. And in fact, the last time when we were trying to get you across to Chobi Mela was when you were trying to escape bail, get bail. And so there was all that happening. But I'd like to take this further, again, link up with what's happening here. Because when I came to Bangladesh, 84, I realized that the independent Bangladesh, the sovereign Bangladesh that I'd left, was in the hands of a military general. He's still there. But we did fight to bring him down. I mean, Irshad came down. We felt we had democracy. We had Khalida, we had Hasina, we had Khalida, and then we had Hasina, and Hasina. But, what happened to democracy?
What happened to democracy? Good question, I mean, basically, all the institutions that are meant to make up democracy have been violated, penetrated, overturned in some ways. And democracy in our part of the world has been reduced to mean elections, rigged or not, So I think that all of us, I mean, in this entire subcontinent, in different ways. I mean, India, I think, is in a stage which, you're still moving towards. But basically, the way I see it is that, like in the late 80s, early 90s, the Indian government opened two locks. One was the lock of the protected market, and one was the lock of the disputed site of the Babri Masjid. And they opened these two locks and they unleashed two kinds of fundamentalisms, Islamic the Hindu fundamentalism and economic fundamentalism. And both fundamentalisms made them able to manufacture the bogeymen of anti-state people, the Maoist anti-development, Islamic terrorists, anti-national. Then now they've all sort of merged together in some ways, but both allowed the state to militarize, So I'll read you a little bit about this meditation on what has happened to democracy. It's it's actually a very, very serious, question, you know, what has happened, because it's been taken back into the workshop and trundled out as something that we don't recognize anymore. This is from the introduction of this book of essays, and it's called Democracy's Failing Light. While we're still arguing about whether there's life after death, can we add another question to the cart? Is there life after democracy? What sort of life will it be? By democracy, I don't mean democracy as an ideal or an aspiration, but I mean the working model, Western liberal democracy and its variants such as they are. So is there life after democracy? Attempts to answer this question often turn into a comparison of different systems of governance, and in the end up with a sort of prickly, combative defense of democracy. It's flawed, we say. It isn't perfect, but it's better than everything else that's on offer. Inevitably, someone in the room will say, Afghanistan, Saudi Arabia, Somalia, is that what you would prefer? Whether democracy should be the utopia that all developing societies aspire to is a separate question altogether. The question about life after democracy addressed to those of us who already live in democracies or in countries that pretend to be democracies. It isn't meant to suggest that we lapse into older discredited models of totalitarian or authoritarian government. It's meant to suggest that the system of representative democracy, too much representation, too little democracy, needs some structural adjustment. The question really is, what have we done to democracy? What have we turned it into? What happens once democracy has been used up, when it has been hollowed out and emptied of meaning? What happens when each of its institutions has metastasized into something dangerous? What happens now that democracy and the free market have fused into a single predatory organism with a thin, constricted imagination that revolves almost entirely around the idea of maximizing profit? Is it possible to reverse this process? Can something that has mutated go back to being what it used to be? What we need today for the sake of the survival of this planet is long-term vision. Can governments whose very survival depends on immediate, extractive, short-term gain provide this? Could it be that democracy, the sacred answer to our short-term hopes and prayers, the protector of our individual freedoms and nurturer of our avaricious dreams, will turn out to be the end game for the human race? Could it be that democracy is such a hit with modern humans precisely because it mirrors our greatest folly, our nearsightedness, our inability to live in the present like most animals do, combined with our inability to see very far into the future, makes us strange, in-between creatures, neither beast nor prophet. Our amazing intelligence seems to have outstripped our instinct for survival. We plunder the earth, hoping that accumulating material surplus will make up for the profound, unfathomable thing that we have lost.
Well, in Bangladesh, going back to the Shah period, I mean, Bangladesh was built on principles of secularism and socialism. We seem to have forgotten both. And when Ershad was tottering, he, for political expediency, introduced religion as official religion. Islam became the official religion of Bangladesh. And we've tried to go back a little bit, but not very far. But now we have another thing. I mean, you now have the new mantra of economic growth, of development. We're told that, stick with the GDP growth, we can worry about human rights and development and freedom and democracy later. But that's happening across our borders. You have the same.
Well, let's say 20 years ago when I was writing The Greater Common Good and so on, that used to be something that worked. you know, development is the mantra, and all of you who are opposing these things are anti-development. Local people would be told, oh, you get jobs, that's why you get jobs on the dam site, you'll get jobs in the steel factory, you'll get jobs in the coal mines, and so on. But now what has happened is that it's like, you know, it's like this aircraft that took off full of hopeful people, and that aircraft is just frozen in the air, and that hope has turned to anger, you know. So we are living at a time of what is known as jobless growth. Recently, Oxfam did a study which said that 9 individual Indians own the combined wealth of the bottom 500 million, you know. Recently, I won't speak about the complications of capitalism and caste fusing together into a new kind of alloy in India, but if you look at the caste of all these billionaires, you find it's the same caste, you know, the trading caste, known as Vaishyas or Baniyas, Gandhi's caste. And you see that, you know, recently the Supreme Court made a judgment, an order, which has now been stayed, but basically it said that 2 million Adivasis should be evicted from their forest homes by July, because now there are no forests left and the Adivasis are endangering the forests. Earlier they were evicted because you needed to build dams, you needed to build mines, you needed to build roads. Now they are evicted because you need to preserve the environment. Either way, they are evicted, you know. And you have a sense of course, the current ruling regime is critiquing dynastic politics, and obviously meaning Rahul Gandhi and so on. But my point is, whatever it is, you know, Rahul Gandhi has to stand and win an election. But what about the Ambanis, you know? The Ambanis just inherit everything, and they own India, they own telecommunication, they own petroleum, they own, and mostly they own now the whole digital platform, you know. So they own information. They say data is the new oil, you know. They own this country, and they inherit it from generation to generation, expanding it. So today, if you say in India, do it for development, people will question, what do you mean by that, and development for whom? Because it's become so grotesque, you know, what they mean by development and who is paying the price for it. But because that rage is building, you have a situation where these policies can only be pushed through, these new neoliberal policies can only be pushed through if you're a pretty military state. So you have laws like the same as you have, Unlawful Activities Prevention Act and so on, which allow hundreds of people. I mean, in India they are smarter, there are thousands of people actually in prison, but they are mostly poor people, mostly people who don't have lawyers, who don't know why they are in jail, but because they are protesting these development projects. We have, I mean, when you were in jail, I wrote to you and I said, dear Shahidul, but I also want to say, dear Sai Baba, dear Gautam, dear Raju, dear Sudha, dear Shoma, all those people are still in jail. You know, all those people are still in jail. And for what? For what? Protesting the violence of the state against its poorest people. And this is what I mean, I just said, you know, if your constitution gives the Supreme Court the right to take away the homelands, which is everything from the poorest Adivasi people, but if you were to suggest the redistribution of the wealth of those 9 wealthy people, can you imagine what would fall on your head? You know, it would be considered blasphemy. It would be considered crazy. In fact, when I wrote The Greater Common Good, the first time I was hauled up for contempt of court, it was because I said that to give an Adivasi person cash compensation for their land would be the equivalent of paying a Supreme Court judge his salary in fertilizer bags. And they were like, this is a disrespect to the court, and I was given some very long and wordy warnings about this, and then it just kept going. Then some people accused me of every 5 or 6 years, 5 male lawyers file cases against a criminal case against me. So that one was that I had tried to kill them outside the gates of the court, and then the Supreme Court summoned me to explain myself, and I said, well, don't you have anything better to do than this? And they were like, oh, this is completely contemptuous, you're scandalizing the court, and they would throw my book from one brother judge to the next, referring to me only as that woman. So I used to call myself the hooker that won the booker. And then they asked me to apologize, and when I didn't, they told me that I wasn't behaving like a reasonable man, and so on. So, but what I'm saying is, if you actually just suddenly drop the lenses that they put on your eyes and look at the brazen injustice that is consecrated and dressed up as law, it's just horrible. I mean, there's this, of course, it's all been happening for centuries. There's that beautiful anonymous poem which is in one of my books. I love it. It says, the law locks up the hapless felon who steals the goose from off the common, but lets the greater felon loose who steals the common from the goose.
Well, I mean, one of the things, that letter was just so beautiful, and while I was inside, it was Renaman Saidia who told me about it, and I'm not going to tell you how they got it to me, but I did get to see it and read it. Couldn't respond at that time until much later. But, smear campaigns, in some ways trying to undermine our character and all sorts of things, seem to be the standard practice. They try other things, but that fails, this is what they tried. But you've been called other things as well. You've been accused of calling Maoists Gandhians with guns. Tell us about that.
Yeah, well, this was something that I've never managed to get over, because at a time when the Congress was in power, actually the UPA government, they announced something called Operation Green Hunt, and they flooded the forests of Bastar, Orissa, Jharkhand with paramilitary. They had this vigilante army called the Salwa Judum. They were going around burning, raping, killing, and it was just, and the propaganda, on the TV, as usual, you had these people with these black masks, like you do know that they are sex killers, Lashkar-e-Toiba, Maoists, all sort of blurred into one, So and then I'll read that little bit of that essay to you, Walking with the Comrades. I went into the forest. Really, I spent 3 weeks with the guerrillas and came out with this essay called Walking with the Comrades. But there was a part about it in which I mentioned Gandhi, and The Guardian and Outlook sort of pulled out a sentence and made it the caption of a main photograph, which then ended up with everybody saying, oh, she's calling the Maoists Gandhians with guns, which of course I hadn't. I'll read that passage to you, and then I'll read the beginning of Walking with the Comrades, which is fun. One sec. Where could that be? So this was I'm just clarifying the Gandhians with guns thing. We're moving in single file now. Myself and 100 quote unquote senselessly violent, bloodthirsty insurgents. I looked around at the camp before we left. There are no signs that almost 100 people had camped here, except for some ash where the fires had been. I cannot believe this army. As far as consumption goes, it's more Gandhian than any Gandhian and has a lighter carbon footprint than any climate change evangelist. But for now, it even has a Gandhian approach to sabotage. Before a police vehicle is burnt, for example, it is stripped down and every part is cannibalized. The steering wheel is straightened out and made into a Bharmar barrel, that's a local gun. The Rexine upholstery stripped and used for ammunition pouches, the battery for solar charging. Should I write a play, I wonder, Gandhi, get your gun, or will I be lynched? And this turned into my calling them Gandhians with guns. It was stupid. But anyway, I'll just read the beginning of this. It was really interesting, you know, the idea that I had been with the Gandhi and Narmada movement for so many years, and you could sense, and through this 20 years of writing, you can sense the violence building up, you know, the anger building up in people. But of course, I always said to both people that, you know, although you think that there's a big ideological war between those who believe in nonviolence and those who are staging an armed struggle, to me it's just tactical, because you can't have an armed struggle in an open village, you know, they just mow you down. Whereas you can't have a nonviolent struggle in the middle of the forest. And I keep saying, you know, if you're in a forest 4 days walk from the main road and 1,000 contingent BSF, I mean border security force or whoever, paramilitary comes and burns the village and rapes the women, what do you want them to do? Go on a hunger strike? They don't have any food anyway. They are hungry. They don't have anything to boycott. You know, so it's a tactical thing. But this is just the beginning of this essay called Walking with the Comrades. The terse typewritten note slipped under my door in a sealed envelope confirmed my appointment with India's single biggest internal security challenge. This is what the Prime Minister Manmohan Singh called them, the poorest people in the world, the single biggest internal security threat challenge. I've been waiting for months to hear from them. I had to be at the Ma Danteshwari Mandir in Dantewara, Chhattisgarh, at any 4 given times on 2 given days. That was to take care of bad weather, punctures, blockades, transport strikes, and sheer bad luck. The note said the writer should have a camera, a tikka, Hindi, and coconut. The meter will have a cap, Hindi Outlook magazine, and bananas. The password will be Namaskar Guruji. Namaskar Guruji. I wondered whether the meter and greeter would be expecting a man and whether I should get myself a moustache. There are many ways to describe Dantewada. It's an oxymoron. It's a border town smack in the heart of India. It's the epicenter of a war. It's an upside-down, inside-out town. In Dantewada, the police wear plain clothes and the rebels wear uniforms. The jail superintendent is in jail and the prisoners are free. 300 of them escaped from the old town jail 2 years ago. Women who have been raped are in police custody and the rapists give speeches in the bazaar. Across the Indravati River, in the area controlled by the Maoists, is the place police call Pakistan. There the villages are empty, but the forests are full of people. Children who ought to be in school run wild. In the lovely forest villages, the concrete school buildings have either been blown up in a heap or they are full of policemen. The deadly war that's unfolding in the jungle is a war that the government of India is both proud and shy of. Operation Green Hunt has been proclaimed as well as denied by P. Chidambaram, India's Home Minister and CEO of the war. And yet substantial funds have been allocated to it and tens of thousands of troops are being mobilized for it. Though the theatre of war is in the jungles of central India, it will have serious consequences for us all. If ghosts are the lingering spirit of someone or something that has ceased to exist, then perhaps the National Mineral Development Corporation's new 4-lane highway crashing through the forest is the opposite of a ghost. Perhaps it's the harbinger of what is still to come. I'm just skipping to the time I arrive at the forest. I arrived at the Ma Danteshwari Mandir well in time for my appointment, first day, first show. I had my camera, my small coconut, and a powdery red tika on my forehead. I wondered if someone was watching me and having a laugh. Within minutes, a young boy approached me. He had a cap and a backpack, school bag, chipped red nail polish on his fingernails, no Hindi outlook, no bananas. Are you the one who's going in? He asked me. No, namaskar, Guruji. I didn't know what to say. He took out a soggy note from his pocket and handed it to me. It said, Outlook nahi mila. Couldn't find Outlook. And the bananas? I asked. I ate them, he said. I got hungry. He really was a security threat. His backpack said, Charlie Brown, not your ordinary blockhead. He said his name was Mangtu. I soon learned that Dandakaranya, the forest I was about to enter, was full of people who had many names and fluid identities. It was like balm to me, that idea. How lovely not to be stuck with yourself, to become someone else for a while. We walked to the bus stand only a few minutes away from the temple. It was already crowded. Things happened quickly. There were 2 men on motorbikes. There was no conversation, just a glance of acknowledgement, a shifting of body weight, the revving of engines. I had no idea where we were going. We passed the house of the superintendent of police, which I recognized from my last visit. He was a candid man, the superintendent. See, ma'am, frankly speaking, this problem can't be solved by us, police or military. The problem with those tribals is that they don't understand greed. Unless they become greedy, there's no hope for us. I've told my boss, remove the force and instead put a TV in every home. Everything will be automatically sorted out. In no time at all, we were riding out of town. No tail. It was a long ride, 3 hours by my watch. It ended abruptly in the middle of nowhere on an empty road with forest on either side. Mangtu got off, I did too. The bikes left and I picked up my backpack and followed the small internal security challenge into the forest. It was a beautiful day. The forest floor was a carpet of gold. In a while we emerged on the white sandy banks of a broad, flat river. It was obviously monsoon fed, so now it was more or less a sand flat. At the center, a stream ankle deep, easy to wade across. Across was Pakistan. Out there, ma'am, the candid superintendent of police had said to me, my boys shoot to kill. I remembered this as we began to cross. I saw us in a policeman's rifle sights, tiny figures in a landscape, easy to pick off. But Mangtu seemed quite unconcerned, and I took my cue from him.
There is another aspect. I mean, we don't sadly have enough time to pick up one area I would have liked to have done. Your breaking of the Gandhi myths, and particularly the Gandhi Ambedkar essay. It's a very important essay, but we don't really have the time to discuss that. But I'd like to move on to something else. I mean, the last time when we were trying to get you across, the idea was that we'd have Snowden and yourself, and we would interact at Chobi Mela as we did with Chomsky and Mahashita Devi earlier. We got both of you to agree, and linking with Snowden was horribly difficult because, you know, all the encryption and everything we had to do, but in the end, it didn't work out. But you met Snowden in Moscow. Tell us about that.
I met Snowden in Moscow, yes. I went with Daniel Ellsberg, who was the Snowden of the 70s, you know, the man who actually leaked, which is a horrible word, but the Pentagon Papers, and which had a huge effect on the Vietnam War. And Dan is like 83 or something when I went with him, and John Cusack, who I knew and who just called me and said, hey, you want to come? I said, okay. And so the three of us went to Moscow, met Snowden. I mean, we did a little book about it. It was called Things That Can and Cannot Be Said, although much of what happened there isn't in the book. Snowden got a little nervous because as soon as I met him, he said, I know why you've come. So I said, why? He says, to radicalize me. I said, yeah, you need to be radicalized, and what are you doing posing for portraits wrapped in the American flag and so on. And then we had a pretty provocative conversation. You know, I was like, how could you have signed up for the Marines for the Iraq war? And, you know, he said, hey man, I just believe the propaganda. I said, yeah, like every generation of Americans believes that history starts with them, you know, like forget about Vietnam, forget about Latin America, forget. So by the end of it, I thought he got like almost worried about agreeing with me too much or something. So anyway, there's not a lot of that in this. But one thing that he's brilliant about, absolutely brilliant, and you know, obviously he set off that alarm a few years ago, and now it's become such a serious thing, you know, the whole issue of surveillance. In India, they're trying this Aadhaar card, you know, with biometrics. It's like creating a society that lives in a grid of surveillance where they have all the information about you, all the information to manipulate, to target you, to prevent any forms of networking or solidarity building, you know. And that also leads to one of the things I keep talking about in India, you know, often I speak quite often at big Dalit meetings, and I say, look, we have to fight the past, we have to fight the present, and we have to fight the future. Because the past, obviously, as the Russians say, is unpredictable, you know, and the history that is written by mostly upper caste male Indians is I mean, first it was written by the Brits, then it was written by these, and it's such a skewed history, you know. And then you have the present, and then you have the future, which is what the left, I think, hasn't yet got its coordinates right about. The future of automation, the future of artificial intelligence, which is certainly to a great degree going to make a huge section of the human population redundant in some ways, not participate in economic activity, which might, I mean, which could have been a great thing if there was an egalitarian politics at work. But if the politics is that even when that hasn't happened, there are no jobs and there are 9 people owning the wealth of 500 million people, when a population is genuinely redundant, it's a very dangerous situation for human beings. So what does the left do when a working class is no longer required? You know, these are things we really do need to think very seriously about.
You've also talked about artificial intelligence and how writing or writers have to think about where their role is when artificial intelligence can paint and write.
Artificial intelligence can make masterpieces of music, of literature, poetry. So the thing is that the first premise there is that what you write is a product and it can be perfected. It doesn't take into account, of course, the fulfillment of the artist's desire to create. It doesn't matter if it's flawed, it doesn't matter if it's not perfect, but I certainly, for me, I mean, my blood will not settle when I'm thinking of something until I've written it. I don't think it will work if I just press some buttons and the novel came out with an algorithm, you know. But the thing is that all of us will be in some ways, I mean, it's conceptual. conceptually a different space now, where even what it means to be human is not all that certain, you know. I don't mean emotionally, I mean just physically, like what is a human being, you know. So these are things that we do need to be thinking about in the future.
Well, and after 20 years of essays, political essays, a range of different things, then when no one was expecting it, perhaps your publisher was, but I'm not sure. After all that time comes out this incredible book, The Ministry of Utmost Happiness, with characters as bizarre and as human, and as strange and as lovable as Saddam Hussein and Anjum, and set in that graveyard, and the horse tracking down. I mean, as I go through that, it's so visual as well. And in fact, that was what initially was our introduction. It was the book Blink by Faded, where you had been invited to write an essay because your writing was so visual. Tell us about Utmost Happiness.
Well, Utmost Happiness, you know, obviously, after I finished writing The God of Small Things, I didn't believe that it was my duty to keep, you know, producing novels at regular intervals. And obviously there's this journey through these worlds that the political writing took me. Part of it was settling in me, like, you know, there were so many things and so many complex things that were not part of the political essay writing, which was an argument, which was an intervention, which was a plea to look at the world differently. But as I made those arguments, there was something else settling in me, you know. I would go to a place like Kashmir, and I knew that whatever I have to say politically about Kashmir is pretty simple, and I said it. But to me, it's impossible to write about Kashmir except in fiction, because it's not just about, you know, human rights reports and human rights abuses and who is tortured and who has been killed, but what do you do when the air is seeded with that kind of terror? You know, what are the negotiations that take place? How do people manage to survive? What is the humor? One of the first things I started to do when I went to Kashmir was to write the Kashmir English alphabet, which is part of the vocabulary of the book, like a little dictionary, you know. And also I felt that everything that had built up inside me over these 20 years, I felt, you know, in this era of specialization, where you're told whether you're a doctor or whether you're a journalist or whether you're an academic, you have your beat, or whether you're an NGO, you know, what is your funding, you know, what is your funding proposal? You have to have a catch line, you know. So I'm an expert on caste, I'm an expert on gender, I work in whatever. And to me, ultimately, all this is a part of the air we breathe. And the radical understanding can only come when you can tell what are the connections between all these things, not understanding them individually in silos, you know. And that, I thought, only a novel can do. A novel, an experimental novel can do. And of course, I could never have written The Ministry of Utmost Happiness if I had taken advances of money from publishers and so on, because I had to do it as a free person, you know. And so it took many years of experimenting with the form of the novel itself before I was ready to get it published.
And of course, you have Kashmir, we have the Chittagong Hill Tracts, so there are many similarities in terms of occupation, in terms of what happens to them. But perhaps we could have a reading from the Ministry of Utmost Happiness?
Or shall we see the film?
We could do the film first. It's a beautiful film, so that would be a nice way of doing it. Yeah.
We just, friends of mine actually made this. It's a 6-minute film, because you'll see that the book ranges through so many landscapes. And when I was speaking, you know, at readings outside, I knew that whatever I read, you wouldn't get a sense of the rest of the book. So tree. At dawn she saw the crows off and welcomed the bats home. At dusk she did the opposite. When people called her names, clown without a circus, queen without a palace, she let the hurt blow through her branches like a breeze and used the music of her rustling leaves as balm to ease the pain. Who says my name is Anjum? I'm not Anjum, I'm Anjuman. I'm a mehfil, I'm a gathering of everybody and nobody, of everything and nothing. Is there anyone else you'd like to invite? Everyone's invited. Kashmiri English alphabet. Ever since she was old enough to insist, she had insisted on being called Miss Jibril. Dear Comrade Azad Bhartiya Garu, my comrade Suguna knows to send this letter to you when she hears that I am no more. As you know, we are banned underground people,
And this letter from me you can call as underground of underground. Thank you, comrade, for reading this. How to tell a shattered story by slowly becoming everybody new, by slowly becoming everything.
So, the Ministry of Utmost Happiness is a book that I couldn't have written if I hadn't lived the 20 years of my life the way I've lived them. And yet, to me, it really, I was so very conscious about the fact that it isn't that I want to sort of write a manifesto that's masquerading as a novel, but actually to infuse the literary imagination into what is darkened or deadened by just sloganeering or politics or something so simple. So one of the most interesting parts for me of writing this book was that one of the main characters is an intelligence officer, and I could easily have made him sort of easy meat, like some person that I just demolished with my deadly intellect. But actually, he's a brilliant guy. His name is Biplop Das Gupta, and his friends call him Garson Hobart because that's the name of a character he plays in a college play. And so, actually, to look at a novel that sort of circles around things and it's almost like a city that circles around itself in complicated ways. And for me, that was it was very interesting to explore what fiction can do and I was not frightened of being difficult. I felt like, okay, so I've written that great beloved bestseller. Now let me try and do something really local and really difficult. And I must say I was surprised that this book has actually gone into more translations than The God of Small Things has. But I'll end, I guess, with a reading. It's difficult to know which part, but I'll end with sort of towards the end the chapter that sort of moves into Kashmir, and it's called The Untimely Death of Miss Jabin I. Ever since she was old enough to insist, she had insisted on being called Miss Jabin. It was the only name she would answer to. Everyone had to call her that, her parents, her grandparents, the neighbors too. She was a precocious devotee of the Miss fetish that had gripped the Kashmir Valley in the early years of the insurrection. All of a sudden, fashionable young ladies, especially in the towns, insisted on being addressed as Miss. Miss Momin, Miss Ghazala, Miss Farhana. It was only one of the many fetishes of the times. In those blood-dim years, for reasons nobody fully understood, people became what can only be described as fetish-prone. Other than the Miss fetish, there was a nurse fetish, a PT instructor fetish, and a roller skating fetish. So in addition to checkposts, bunkers, weapons, grenades, landmines, Cassipiers, concertina wires, soldiers, insurgents, counterinsurgents, spies, special operatives, double agents, triple agents, and suitcases of cash from agencies on both sides of the border. The valley was also awash with nurses, PT instructors, and roller skaters, and, of course, misses. Among them, Miss Jabin, who didn't live long enough to become a nurse, nor even a roller skater. In the Mazar-e-Shohada, the martyrs' graveyard where she was first buried, the cast iron signboard that arched over the main gate said in 2 languages, "We gave our todays for your tomorrows." It's corroded now, the green paint faded, the delicate calligraphy flecked with pinholes of light. Still, there it is, after all these years, silhouetted like a swatch of stiff lace against the sapphire sky and the snowy, saw-toothed mountains. There it still is. Miss Jabin was not a member of the committee that decided what should be written on the signboard, but she was in no position to argue with its decision. Also, Miss Jabin hadn't notched up very many todays to trade in for tomorrows. But then the algebra of infinite justice was never so rude. In this way, without being consulted on the matter, she became one of the movement's youngest martyrs. She was buried right next to her mother, Begum Arifa Yasvi. Mother and daughter died by the same bullet. It entered Miss Jabin's head through her left temple and came to rest in her mother's heart. In the last photograph of her, the bullet wound looked like a cheerful summer rose arranged just above her left ear. A few petals had fallen on her coffin, the white shroud she was wrapped in before she was laid to rest. Miss Jabin and her mother were buried along with the 15 others, taking the toll of their massacre to 17. At the time of their funeral, the Mazar-e-Shohada was still fairly new, but was already getting crowded. However, the Intizamiya Committee, the organizing committee, had its ear to the ground from the very beginning of the insurrection and had a realistic idea of things to come. It planned the layout of the graves carefully, making ordered, efficient use of the available space. Everyone understood how important it was to bury martyrs' bodies in collective burial grounds and not leave them scattered in their thousands like bird feed up in the mountains or in the forests around the army camps and torture centers that had mushroomed across the valley. When the fighting began and the occupation tightened its grip, for ordinary people, the consolidation of their dead became in itself an act of defiance. Thank you.
That gives us a wonderful taste of the literary aspect of your work, the meandering, the multi-layered elements, the complexities of the characters, people you can't really put in any category as such, and you don't really know how to feel about them because they're terrible people who you also like. So tell us a little bit about the structure of the novel. There's no linearity here, there's no beginning, body, and any of that conventional stuff, and while you grasp your way through that, it's a wonderful meandering journey.
Well, I guess, I think it's beyond me to be able to tell a linear story. It might be the architect in me, that doesn't think that you design a building with the entrance and end your design with the exit or something. So there is that sense of, to me, how you structure the structure, the language, and the narrative are sort of fused together in ways that are very, very important to me. And it's only later that I realized, sometimes what I've done, because it's a bit like, the rhythm and you listen to it, but it's very, very carefully structured. But the early part of the novel opens in the old city of Delhi with Anjum, who you saw. And she is born as Aftab, and changes to Anjum, and eventually ends up moving into a graveyard just outside the old city where she lives in the graveyard for a long time as this ravaged, strange spectre who has suffered a lot of grief. But then she builds the Jannat guest house in the graveyard, enclosing many graves. And that Jannat guest house, somehow it comforts me a lot in my life now, you know. Somehow it has brought me closer to the ones one loved who are gone, living in the dead, just move from room to room. Each room has a tomb. And in some ways Kashmir, which as you know many people call Jannat, paradise, is in Delhi you have the graveyard covered with the Jannat guest house, and in Kashmir you have the Jannat covered with graveyards, and the story sort of swirls outwards, you know, from the old city to this new metropolis and then into Kashmir. And the structure, it's like a city. I've said this very often, that the idea, can a novel be like a city? You know, can a novel be like a city where you don't give the reader the comfort of knowing only a few people? Like you've got to, and you can't meet Saddam Hussein or the cobbler or the watchman and think that's all they are. They're not cobblers and watchmen and sweepers and intelligence officers and major journalists. They're not. It's not a book only about marginalized people. It's a book where the characters come out to meet you, and everyone has come to that city with a story, with a name, with a cast, with a, you know, with a narrative which sometimes is a little hard to deal with, but you have to deal with it, you know. Yeah.
Could we have one last reading, perhaps?
Maybe we can take some questions, and then I'll end with a very small reading.
Okay, sure. Questions, anyone? One raised hand. If you could wait for the mic, please. I mean, just briefly introduce yourself.
I'm a research specialist at an NGO, and it's that what shapes the context of my question. I was very moved by the section of your essay where you talk about the NGOization of resistance. So I wonder, as an employee of NGO, how can I try my best not to be privy or facilitator of this process, and how can I prevent it? And whether the new mantra of Sustainable Development Goals is the latest example of NGOization of resistance. Thank you.
Well, see, the thing about NGOs is obviously all NGOs are not the same, you know, but NGOs that are part of this corporate social responsibility, the CSR thing, you know, are, to me, a pretty frightening operation, because it's like you allow a certain amount of devastation to take place and then do a little mitigation, you know. So I don't know, obviously I don't know what NGO you work for, but I mean in India obviously now even the NGOs are under attack, you know. But earlier the way things were happening was that as structural adjustment of the economy was forced on people, the state withdrew from its responsibilities of education, of health, of food, of everything, and it was replaced by by NGOs that were pretending to deliver what states were meant to deliver, but turning what ought to be a right into some kind of charity, you know. So this was a real problem. Not in the, I mean, each NGO might have been doing good stuff, but it was part of masking a serious problem, which is now unmasked itself. You know, we have a crisis on the front of, and even in America you have a crisis. I mean, forget in India and Bangladesh and all that. So, and the other thing was the NGOization, which allows, I mean, NGO funding that comes from various organizations that are interested in maintaining the certain economic order, then allow NGOs to do work which may be good work, but which doesn't threaten that economic order. you know. So when I went into the forest, for example, with the Maoists, or with the Narmada movement, there are thousands of women who belong to organizations like the Adivasi Krantikari Mahila Sangathan, you know, the revolutionary women's association. They're fighting the mining companies, they're fighting the dams, they're fighting displacement. Nobody thinks of them as feminists, you know. It's not that people who are officially called feminists come out to support them, because that fight is a fight which annoys the powers that be, because it's challenging the imperial economic order, you know. So that's what I mean.
Other questions? One at the back. Anahita, over there. Can we get a mic there, please?
My name is Anahita and I'm a journalist by profession, and I followed your writing for many years. I think coming from India, one has felt a sense of dispossession and disenfranchisement beginning with 1998 and the nuclear tests, and your writing has at that moment and again over the years given a sense of belonging. So I really thank you for that. My question is about what's happening in India now. And you've spoken of the continuities of inequity, but obviously we see a massive acceleration. And I'm wondering whether you see it as part of a continuum, or whether there is indeed a disjunction, something which has broken further in, let's say, in the time of he who shall not be named.
He who must be named. No, I do think there's a disjunction, you know. I do think that classically, you know, someone was asking me, how would you define a liberal? And I said, maybe that person who says what a radical was saying 20 years ago, you know. So you have a situation where it has been enabled. I mean, the situation we have today has been enabled by those who call themselves secular and liberal. Many of them think of themselves as secular, but are very, very pro the whole corporate, the whole neoliberal economic policy agenda. That injustice they have no problem with, but they do have a certain squeamishness towards the communal issue. But as I said, the both have waltzed together. But we must remember that the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh, the organization to which Mr. Modi belongs and to which most of the ministers belong, was set up in 1925 in India. It has openly said that it believes India should be a Hindu nation. In 1950, it said the Constitution of India is a foreign document, and the real constitution should be the Manusmriti, which is a text which valorizes caste and Hinduism and all of that. So now, you know, all of that has been given official sanction. So every institution, whether it's courts, whether it's intelligence agencies, whether it's universities, whether it's pedagogy, all of it has been taken over by this kind of ideology. So even if the BJP loses the elections, those institutions remain, and most of all, the media remains. You know, the media, which is 400 24-hour news channels. Some, like for example, Reliance Ambani alone own 27 24-hour news channels. You know, sort of constant propaganda. Let's call them propaganda channels. You know, but so what do you do with all this? You know, the problem is that we are in a situation where unless it is aggressively purged in some ways, not just with a change of government, but with a look at what is happening to each of these institutions. I mean, history books are being rewritten. A whole generation will grow up not knowing that there used to be such a thing as intelligence. you know? I keep saying our problem is not fascism, it's cretinism, you know, it's cretinism. And we have an attack on all forms of intelligence right now, an outright hostility towards all forms of intelligence, all forms of science. You know, in the Indian Science Congress, a senior scientist also at the university said, you know, my first presentation is that Einstein was completely wrong about relativity. And the second point was that he had written a letter correcting Professor Stephen Hawking about the black hole. And his third point was that magnetic waves should be renamed as Modi waves. So, you know, like, I rest my case. Like, what do you do? You know? So, it's a serious problem we have on our hands. And I do believe that they will lose the next election. But that will still be unfinished business for those of us who are trying to get back something and then build from there, you know?
Another. 1, 2, 3. There's one. Too many hands. We can't take that many, but let's start from here. Take this one.
Hi, I'm Sky. I'm a writer too. I guess my question would like to go back to the letters that you exchanged, and perhaps towards a conversation about solidarity or South Asian solidarity. To perhaps comment on this moment and this meeting and this venue, and I believe there was a panel yesterday that said that the word solidarity has to move away from its kind of more romantic notions into perhaps more urgent and political ideas, and I was just hoping you would comment on that. Maybe both of you, actually.
Yeah, Shahidul, why don't you?
Go back. I was drifting away for a minute. Shall I come back to you? No, let me come back to that, because honestly I was drifting.
Okay, you
go ahead. Yeah.
Okay, so well, I think that you know, one of the things that we really do need to pay attention to is our vocabulary. You know, so I really believe that we should start questioning ourselves when we use words like India and Bangladesh, because that's what they want us to do, you know. They want us to believe that you are here, we are here. They want us to look at these as monolithic things, whereas actually now it is so divided into who feels they have the right to speak, who feels they have the right to define what is nationalism in Bangladesh, what is nationalism in India. So for me, there were so many things about why I felt that it was absolutely necessary to write when Shahidul was in jail, because I think it has to do with art. It has to do with the fact that this is an artist of a kind which is way beyond these to me, that's so important, not to allow it to be pulled down into a space where, as I said, it's masquerading as sloganeering politics, you know. So my solidarity with him was about art, actually. I mean, there are many people who make jokes about the fact that when my first encounter with the anti-dam movement was, they asked me to inaugurate some exhibition of paintings that had been donated to them to raise money, and I said, no, I don't do all that. You know, if I do something, it'll be bigger than that. And they said, but will you just come? And I went and I realized that painters had just sort of fobbed off some mediocre stuff on them. So I left, and they said, later when they became my pals, they said, you know, we thought you were such a cruel person. I said, why? They said, you just came there and looked at these paintings and laughed and walked away. Why did you do that? I said, well, there's no excuse for bad art, you know? So to me, that is a beautiful form of solidarity. But I think there are many, many, many levels at which that has to operate. And we were joking, saying that, oh, if there had been a South Asian prison, we would have met there, you know, instead of separate ones for Bangladeshi seditionists and Indian seditionists.
I'll just come back to that because you alluded to something. For me, what was very challenging while I was in jail was this very interesting experience where, quite apart from the fact that I didn't have a mobile phone and internet, and people don't believe I can survive on that, but I didn't have a camera. And as a visual person, I was trying to look to see how I could tell a story as a photographer who did not have a camera. And I found it a fascinating exercise. I was looking through a camera, through a lens, without having that physical object with me. And it was something that mesmerized me, to the extent that, you know, there are those grey walls, and it was a dank day with heavy clouds, and there was just a very subtle difference between the greyness of the buildings and the greyness of the skies. And I thought of how would I, as a photographer, have translated that tonality into the medium that I don't have. And not having a camera didn't matter. I was going through the process of imagining things as a visual person does, and I found that quite a powerful way of doing things.
Like a lot of the time
there, and then we'll go to the far back there. Yeah, please. Sorry, I won't be able to take questions from everyone. I do apologize. I think we just running out of time. Yeah, please.
Hi, I am actually a literature student, and I am a huge fan of yours, and I'm carrying your book right now. And I had a question regarding Ministry of... Sorry. I had a question regarding the book Ministry of Utmost Happiness. Like, I wanted to know the significance of the title. Like, what do you visualize when you think of the ministry? Like, what made you choose that name? And also, like, the ending, like, you know, the Jannat guest house, and how everyone comes together and there's acceptance, regardless of what gender, caste, or like religion or whatever you are, there's acceptance and love, and it was a very hopeful and optimistic ending. So, like, my question would be like, do you think that kind of ending, that acceptance, that love is possible for people to have in real life?
Well, don't forget that everyone doesn't get acceptance. Anjum, as the proprietor of the Jannat guest house, is completely irrational, and there are some people that she just instinctively hates and throws out, you know. Whereas she does explain to Saddam at some point that this is the place of falling people, you know. So sometimes, having written all this politics for 20 years, I think maybe my world is just divided into those who Anjum will allow to be buried in the Jannat guest house and those who she'll turn away. So it's certainly not, she's certainly not some touchy-feely teddy bear who's like, oh, everybody's welcome, you know. She is very edgy about it, and she will not agree to bury certain people and so on. Where does the title come from? Well, you know, in Christianity, the ministry is not a bureaucratic thing. It's also the ministry of a priest, you know. And to me, somehow, Anjum is the minister of utmost happiness in the Jannat guest house. And what she does is, I think, in a way, what I said in the end of Imagination, you know. She seeks joy in the saddest places. She pursues beauty to its lair, and she all of them find each other in the most weird and unusual ways. So it's, and it is true. I mean, if you talk to people, like you talk to people who have been, I mean, I'm sure it's the same to an extent in Bangladesh, but it's much more sharpened in India because of the prevalence of caste, that everyone lives in a kind of grid, a hierarchical grid. And all these characters somehow, perhaps because I didn't fit into that grid, I mean, when you don't fit in, you just seek out people who don't fit in different kinds of ways. I wasn't even conscious of it. But there is those people who are sort of off-grid, through whom the grid runs in some ways, who shine the light on the grid in the story.
One question there, the red shirt, and then I'll come to you. That'll be the last, I'm afraid, and then we should go end with a short reading, yeah? Please. I apologize to the people I can't take questions from.
Hi, I am Othui. Towards the end of the novel, The Ministry of Utmost Happiness, there is an insect who is upside down and who is trying to protect if the sky falls to him. Do you connect this situation to the current situation of the country, or where we try? Do you connect yourself while you were writing to Shahidul Sir when he was in prison? Do you think this fictitious story or incident in the novel is currently happening? You can say in this subcontinent or in the world. Thank you.
Well, obviously, obviously the dung beetle who sleeps on his back with his legs in the sky, hoping to save the world if the sky falls down. It's so many of us are that dung beetle. Like we're not closing our eyes and we're not putting our legs down, however ridiculous we might be, And people keep asking me this question, that, oh, so many years you've written the things you've written, and don't you feel defeated sometimes? Don't you feel defeated? I say, look, I never want to be on the other side. So I just do what I do, and I'll go down on this side if I have to. But while I'm doing that, I'll have a bloody good time, So we are having a better time than they are anyway. And it's okay. I mean, also with my complex childhood understanding of failure, I'm okay with it. I'm okay with being the dung beetle.
This question, and then I will take one last one from Anu, and we'll have to close it at that.
I am Mizanur Rahman Khan. I represent Daily Pratham Alok. As a great advocate of Narmada Bachao movement, how do you look at sharing of international rivers between India and her neighbors? Thank you.
Like I said earlier, I don't believe in big dams. I don't believe in river projects which actually block a river and corner its resources and redirect them. I think we have to rethink that whole way of looking at rivers and water. So I don't agree with the program of trying to corner as much water as you can possibly for your country to the detriment of someone else. I don't believe in that.
Anu, this is the last question.
Anu Muhammad speaking now. Very welcome, Arundhati, to Dhaka. It is better late than never, and we are expecting you from much earlier. I would like to make point on South Asian solidarity. We have many common issues. we have common enemies, we have common potentials. There is a strong necessity and also potential of South Asian solidarity. You are talking about, forget about the country's name, India, Bangladesh, Pakistan, because we have many common problems. But the thing is, in building South Asian solidarity, the people of India, progressive writers, intellectuals in India, can do and have to do much more than other countries, because India is the strongest country here. Indian ruling class is the strongest, and the corporate groups, they are like making business and corporate aggression on other countries. So the problems like in Bangladesh, the Rampal coal-fired power plant by NTPC, or projects by Reliance and Adani, and the outsourced Rupur nuclear power plant to India, all these problems, including transit and river sharing problems, all these problems, when we are suffering and when people are getting agitated against India, then the South Asian solidarity demands voices from India. But what we are missing, that people, intellectuals, even left parties are not that aware of the situation in neighboring countries. And we are afraid that as form of nationalism, national chauvinism is also affecting, and also new liberal developmentalism is also grabbing left and other intellectuals. So now, therefore, we are not listening anything, very little, about the problems Bangladesh facing, like transit, river sharing, Rampal coal-fired power plant, or all these projects. So can we expect that these things will going to change very soon? And we are expecting a decisive role or effective role from a person, writer and activist like Arundhati Roy. Can we expect that?
So, I mean, we spoke about this morning, and I completely agree with what you're saying. And I will say that, you know, I mean, in this area, it's that Indian writers and activists are letting everybody down, including in India. You know, you're not seeing anybody writing about these issues anymore, you know. So, I mean, part of me wants to say yes, of course, you know, to you, but I also am an individual who's under so much pressure all the time, you know. So, of course, having met you and being here, you know, when I write something, because I get attacked so powerfully, you know, I have to know everything about what I write before I write it, which means that it takes months for me to do something, to travel, to go, to be sure that I'm sure of myself, you know. So I would love to come and do that someday when I can, certainly, you know.
We'd love to have more questions, but I think we'd agree that a reading would probably be the nicest way to end this.
Well, it'll just be 1 minute, and it'll be from the very beginning of the Ministry of Utmost Happiness, which is the prologue, actually. At magic hour when the sun has gone, but the light has not, armies of flying foxes unhinge themselves from the banyan trees in the old graveyard and drift across the city like smoke. When the bats leave, the crows come home. Not all the din of their homecoming fills the silence left by the sparrows that have gone missing, and the old white-backed vultures, custodians of the dead for more than 100 million years that have been wiped out. The vultures died of diclofenac poisoning. Diclofenac, cow aspirin, given to cattle as a muscle relaxant to ease pain and increase the production of milk, worked like nerve gas on white-backed vultures. Each chemically relaxed, milk-producing cow or buffalo that died became poisoned vulture bait. As cattle turned into better dairy machines, as the city ate more ice cream, butterscotch crunch, nutty buddy and chocolate chip, as it drank more mango milkshake, vultures' necks began to droop as though they were tired and simply couldn't stay awake. Silver beards of saliva dripped from their beaks, and one by one they tumbled off their branches, dead. Not many noticed the passing of the friendly old birds. There was so much else to look forward to. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, Arundhati Roy. Ask the journalists to come up. They've been very disciplined. They've not interfered, but I think this is an opportunity for them to come and take some pictures.